They were told they were too old, too foolish, too broken to matter anymore, dismissed by their own children and left to fade away quietly. But when this elderly couple spent their last $3,000 on a crumbling mansion everyone else was afraid to touch, they discovered something behind a sealed wall that would silence every person who ever doubted them and prove that sometimes the ones the world throws away are worth more than anyone imagined. Before we explore this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning light crept through the thin curtains of the small apartment on Maple Street, touching everything with a golden sadness that only early autumn can bring. Martha Hayes, 73 years old, with silver hair, pulled back in a careful bun that she'd perfected over 5 decades of practice, stood at the kitchen counter, measuring coffee grounds with the same precision she'd used since 1968. Her hands trembled slightly now, not from fear or anxiety but from time itself, from 7 decades of washing dishes in scalding water and folding endless loads of laundry and holding grandchildren who barely remembered to call anymore, whose voices she heard only through brief text messages that her daughter had to help her read. Beside her at the small formica table that had seen better years, George Hayes sat reading the newspaper through reading glasses, held together with clear tape and stubborn determination. He was 76 and still broad-shouldered, despite the way his cardigan hung a little looser each year, despite the way his belt needed an extra hole that he'd punched himself with an ice pick in the garage. His calloused fingers, permanently stained from 45 years working as a machinist, turned pages that told stories of a world that seemed to have forgotten people like them, people who remembered when a handshake meant something and a promise was kept even when it cost you. They had been married for 52 years, raised 4 children in a 3-bedroom house with a mortgage they paid off in 1998, after scrimping and saving every spare dollar. They had built a life that felt solid, permanent, like oak floors that would hold forever, like foundation stones that couldn't be moved. But forever has a way of ending when you least expect it, arriving not with thunder but with the soft closing of a door, with children who speak in concerned tones about what's best while meaning what's easiest. It started 6 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon when their daughter, Rebecca, came to visit. She didn't come alone. She brought her brother David, her sister Linda, and her youngest brother Thomas. 4 adults in business casual clothing converging on a small apartment, like a carefully planned military operation. They sat around that same small kitchen table, the one George had built with his own hands in 1971. Using lumber he'd gotten on sale and finished with 3 coats of polyurethane, applied with a brush he cleaned between each coat. And they told Martha and George it was time to make some changes. Rebecca spoke first, her voice gentle but firm, modulated in that particular way that professional women learn in corporate training sessions, the way you'd talk to a child who didn't understand why they couldn't have candy for dinner. "Mom, Dad, we've been talking, the 4 of us. We've been discussing your situation. This apartment, it's too much for you now. The stairs are dangerous. You can barely keep up with the cleaning. The bills are piling up. It's time to consider other options." George looked up from his coffee, the mug chipped on one side from when he'd dropped it 2 years ago, but still his favorite because Martha had given it to him on their 30th anniversary. "We manage just fine," he said, his voice quiet but carrying that edge of steel that his children had learned to recognize growing up, the tone that meant he was drawing a line. David leaned forward, his expensive watch catching the light from the kitchen window. "Dad, you're 76. Mom fell last month. You called me at 2 in the morning because you couldn't help her up by yourself. That's not managing. That's barely surviving. You can't keep pretending everything's fine when it clearly isn't. Martha's throat tightened, her fingers curling around the edge of the counter where she still stood, unable to sit down, unable to fully enter this conversation that felt like an ambush. I slipped on the bathroom rug. It was wet. It happens to everyone. I was fine. George helped me up eventually. It wasn't a big deal. Linda shook her head, her highlighted hair perfectly styled, her manicured nails tapping against the folder she'd brought with her. It is a big deal, Mom. What if Dad hadn't been home? What if you'd broken your hip? You're not as young as you used to be. Neither of you are. And it's not just the apartment, your finances. You're spending money on things you don't need. The heating bill last winter was $300. That's outrageous. You need help managing your accounts, making better decisions. The room felt smaller suddenly. The walls pressing in, the apartment that had been their refuge for 5 years, since they'd downsized from the house where they'd raised their family, suddenly felt like a cage that their children were trying to make even smaller. Thomas, the youngest at 41 but still carrying himself with that slight uncertainty that had always made him seem like he was asking permission for his own life, pulled out a glossy folder from his briefcase. We found a nice assisted living facility about 20 minutes from my house. Riverside Gardens. They have activities, medical staff on site, 24/7, 3 meals a day included. Everything you'd need. You wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning, or any of the things that are getting too hard now. George's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his temple, the way it always did when he was trying to control his anger. We're not going to a home. Rebecca reached across the table, her hand extended toward her father but not quite touching him, maintaining that careful distance. It's not a home, Dad. That's outdated terminology. It's a community. A retirement community. You'd have friends your own age, activities designed for seniors, support staff who actually understand what older people need. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining an apartment or paying bills or any of the responsibilities that are clearly becoming too much. That's the problem, Martha said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow cutting through all the other voices in the small kitchen. We don't want to stop worrying. Worry means we're still living. Worry means we still have choices to make. Worry means we're still people, not just patients being managed. The conversation went in circles for 2 hours that felt like days. The children presented budgets they'd prepared without asking, brochures for facilities they'd already visited, legal documents they'd already had, drafted by lawyers whose names were embossed in expensive gold foil, power of attorney papers that would give them control over their parents' finances, healthcare proxy forms that would let them make medical decisions, financial management agreements that would require Martha and George to get permission before spending more than $50. They said it was for the best, that they loved their parents, that they only wanted them safe and cared for and protected from the dangers of independent living at their age. But what Martha and George heard beneath the carefully chosen words was different. They heard, "We're tired of worrying about you. We're tired of the late-night phone calls that interrupt our sleep. We're tired of feeling responsible for your well-being when we have our own families to manage. We're tired of the guilt that comes from not visiting more often. And it would be easier if you were in a place where paid professionals could carry that burden instead of us. You're a complication we need to simplify, a problem we need to solve, a responsibility we need to delegate." When the children finally left 3 hours later, after extracting promises that Martha and George would at least look at the brochures and think about it, and not make any rash decisions. The apartment felt hollow. Martha stood at the window, watching them load into David's black SUV, and she saw them through the glass. They were laughing about something as they pulled away from the curb. All four of them together, in that vehicle that cost more than Martha and George's first house. Rebecca said something and David threw his head back in laughter. Linda was checking her phone. Thomas was eating something from a bag. They looked relieved, unburdened, like people who had just completed an unpleasant but necessary task and could now get back to their real lives. She wondered if they were relieved that the intervention was over, or relieved that they'd taken the first step toward moving their parents into managed care, where someone else would handle the difficult parts of aging. That night, George couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Martha, listening to her breathing, knowing she wasn't asleep either, even though she kept her eyes closed and stayed perfectly still. At 3 a.m, he gave up the pretense and got up, padding in his worn slippers to the small desk in the corner of their bedroom, where they kept their bills and bank statements organized in a system that Martha had maintained for 52 years without fail. Everything was in labeled folders with dates written in Martha's careful handwriting. Every receipt was filed chronologically. Every payment was recorded in the register. Every transaction was accounted for down to the penny. They weren't rich, but they'd been careful. 52 years of being careful, of choosing store brands over name brands, of fixing things instead of replacing them, of saying no to themselves so they could say yes to their children. He opened the checkbook and stared at the balance written in Martha's neat script. $17,432.16. Their life savings after everything else had been spent. After they'd paid for Rebecca's wedding in 1994, the one she'd insisted needed to have 200 guests, and a band and centerpieces that cost $40 each. After they'd given David the loan for his business startup in 2002, money that was supposed to be repaid but never was, vanishing into an LLC that folded after 18 months. After they'd helped Linda pay for her divorce attorney in 2009 when her husband left her for someone younger. After they'd given Thomas the down payment on his house in 2015 because he couldn't save enough on his own. They had given and given and given, the way parents do, the way they were supposed to. And now their children wanted to take what was left and call it help, wanted to manage the final $17,000 and make decisions about how two adults who had successfully navigated 7 decades of life should spend their remaining years. George closed the checkbook carefully and walked to the window. The street was empty at 3 a.m, lit by yellow street lamps that buzzed softly in the autumn night, casting pools of light on pavement that was cracked and patched, not unlike how he felt. He thought about his father, who had worked in the steel mills of Pittsburgh until his hands were scarred and permanently bent, who had died at 78 in a nursing home where the nurses barely knew his name, where he'd been just another old man in a shared room that smelled like disinfectant and defeat, and the particular sadness of people waiting to die. He thought about his mother, who had faded away in that same facility, confused and asking for people who were long dead, her memories dissolving until she didn't recognize her own son. The day George had visited and she'd called him by his father's name, he'd gone home and wept into his pillow, while Martha held him, both of them knowing that this was the future their culture offered to its elderly, to the people who had built the world, the young now inherited. He had promised himself 40 years ago, standing at his mother's funeral, that he would never end that way. He had promised Martha on their 25th anniversary, both of them still young enough to think 70 was ancient and impossibly far away, that they would go out on their own terms, with dignity with purpose, with their minds and choices intact. He just didn't know how. Not with 4 children circling like well-meaning vultures. Not with bank accounts that shrank faster than they grew. Not with bodies that no longer cooperated the way they once had. But the promise remained, a debt to himself and to Martha that he didn't know how to pay. The answer came 3 days later, in the most unlikely place. Sitting on a wooden chair in the public library, where George went every Wednesday morning. His routine for the past 5 years since he'd retired. He read newspapers from neighboring towns, just to feel connected to something beyond his shrinking world, beyond the walls of an apartment that his children wanted to trade for even smaller walls in a facility where someone would dispense his medications and decide when he ate, and probably eventually when he slept. That's when he saw it, tucked in the back pages of the Riverside Gazette in the classified section, that most people skipped past. Public auction, Gilded Age Mansion, Riverside Heights, Saturday, October 14th at 10 in the morning. Minimum bid $1,000. Property sold as is. Where is? No warranties expressed or implied. Buyer responsible for all back taxes and liens. The address was listed as 27 Ashford Lane, and beneath the text was a single grainy black and white photograph that looked like it had been photocopied too many times, showing a massive stone structure with turrets and arched windows. Ivy crawling up its walls like nature, trying to reclaim what humans had abandoned. George stared at that photograph for a long time, maybe 20 minutes, until the librarian walked past and gave him a concerned look. He didn't know why it called to him. Maybe it was the way the mansion sat alone on its hill in the photograph. Forgotten but still standing, refusing to crumble despite decades of neglect. Maybe it was the defiance in those stone walls, the stubborn insistence on existing even when the world had moved on and left it behind. Maybe it was just that it looked like he felt old and damaged but not quite ready to give up yet. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just a wild, desperate idea from a man who was tired of being managed and needed to do something, anything, that was completely his own choice, even if it was completely insane. He tore the page carefully from the newspaper, checking first to make sure the librarian wasn't watching, because he'd never defaced library property in his life and wasn't about to start. He folded it precisely into quarters and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the one that still closed with a button, even though the jacket itself was 15 years old and the elbows were worn thin. When he got home, Martha was in the living room folding laundry, towels, and washcloths, and their clothes, everything still sorted by color the way she'd been doing it since 1965. She looked up when he walked in, and something in the way he moved must have been different because she set down the towel she was folding and stood up. "What is it?" she asked, reading him the way she'd learned to do over 52 years of marriage. George pulled out the folded newspaper page and handed it to her without a word. She unfolded it slowly, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and read the entire auction notice twice. Then she looked at the photograph for a long time. Finally, she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and concern, and maybe, just maybe, a spark of the same reckless hope he was feeling. "What are you thinking?" she whispered. He sat down on the couch beside her, feeling the familiar sag in the cushions where they'd sat together for 5 years. Watching television, they didn't care about just to have something to do, filling time that felt both too long and too short. "I'm thinking we have $17,000 that our children want us to hand over so they can decide how we live and where we die and when we're allowed to make our own choices." She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the outline of the mansion in the grainy photograph. "And you want to spend it on a mansion we've never seen. A building that's probably falling down. A place that no one else wants." He took her hand, feeling the papery texture of her skin, the prominent veins, the gold wedding band that had worn a groove into her finger over 52 years. "I want to spend it on one more adventure. One more choice that's completely ours. One more chance to prove to ourselves and to our children and to everyone who thinks we're just old people waiting to die that we're not done yet. That we still get to decide. That we still matter." Martha looked back down at the photograph. The mansion stared back at her through decades of neglect and abandonment. And somewhere, in those stone walls and broken windows and ivy-covered turrets, she felt an echo of herself, still standing, still waiting, still worth something, even if no one else could see it anymore. She was quiet for so long that George started to think she would say no, would be the voice of reason, would remind him that they were too old for this kind of risk. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Okay," she said. "Let's go see it. Let's at least look at it before we decide we're crazy." The drive to Riverside Heights took 2 hours through winding country roads that cut through forests, just beginning to turn gold and crimson with early autumn. George drove their old sedan, a 2007 Honda Accord with 183,000 miles on it, and a passenger side mirror held on with duct tape. He drove carefully, both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 the way he'd been taught in 1962, while Martha navigated with a paper map spread across her lap. Because neither of them trusted the GPS on phones, they barely understood. They didn't talk much. There was too much weight in what they were considering, too much riding on a gamble that made no practical sense. The children would be furious when they found out. The children would say they'd lost their minds. Maybe they had. But Martha had spent 52 years being practical, being careful, being exactly what everyone expected a good wife and mother to be. And where had it gotten her? To a small apartment where her own children wanted to warehouse her in a facility until she died quietly and conveniently out of the way. They found Ashford Lane just before noon. The road narrowed as it climbed into the hills, pavement cracking and crumbling into gravel, trees pressing close on both sides, like they were trying to hide something shameful, trying to protect a secret that the world had forgotten. Then the trees opened up suddenly, and there it was. The mansion rose from the hillside like something from another century, which it was. Built in 1887, according to the faded historical marker that stood crooked near the broken gates, it was a sprawling testament to Gilded Age excess, when railroad barons and oil tycoons built monuments to their own wealth and power. All dark stone and peaked roofs and towers that reached toward the sky like prayers that had gone unanswered for too long. Windows that caught the autumn light like watchful eyes. A grand porte-cochere that must have sheltered carriages and later automobiles carrying people in clothes that cost more than most families earned in a year. But time had not been kind, and nature had reclaimed what had been taken from it. The roof sagged in multiple places, tiles missing or cracked. Many windows were broken, dark empty eyes staring out at nothing. Others were boarded over with plywood that had weathered gray. The grand front steps were cracked, weeds growing through the stones with stubborn determination. The iron fence that once guarded the property leaned drunkenly inward, more suggestion than barrier, held up only by the ivy that wrapped around it. Martha stepped out of the car slowly, her hand on the door for balance, and stared up at the structure. "It's enormous," she breathed, her voice carrying awe and fear in equal measure. George came around to stand beside her. his arm naturally finding its place around her shoulders. "It's falling apart," he said, but there was something in his voice that wasn't disappointment. She smiled faintly, leaning into him the way she had for 52 years. They walked up the long driveway together, their footsteps crunching on gravel and broken stone, the sound seeming too loud in the silent autumn afternoon. A small group had already gathered near the front entrance, maybe 5 or 6 people, and Martha felt her stomach tighten. Competition. There was a young couple in expensive North Face jackets and designer jeans, probably real estate flippers who watched HGTV and thought they could turn anything into profit. An older man in dirty overalls who looked like a contractor, squinting up at the roofline and probably calculating demolition costs versus salvage value. A woman with a clipboard who Martha guessed was the auctioneer, checking her watch with the impatience of someone who had 3 more auctions to get to that afternoon, and standing off to the side, smoking a cigarette and staring at the mansion like it owed him something. A thin man in his 50s with hollow cheeks and restless eyes. The auctioneer checked her watch one more time and cleared her throat, the sound sharp in the quiet. "All right, folks, let's get started. My name is Patricia Winters from County Auctions Incorporated. This property, known locally as the Ashford Estate, is being sold by the county to settle back taxes and liens. The structure was built in 1887 by railroad magnate Charles Ashford. It's been abandoned since 1976, when the last heir died intestate. No utilities connected, no recent inspections, no engineering reports, no guarantees of structural integrity whatsoever. You're buying 43 acres of land and whatever's standing on them. As is. Where is?" She paused, looking around at the small group. "Minimum bid is $1,000. Any takers?" The young couple whispered to each other, heads close together. The woman shook her head firmly. They walked back to their BMW without another word. The contractor took one more long look at the sagging roof and followed them, muttering something about money pits. The thin man with the cigarette flicked it away and left without explanation, climbing into a pickup truck and driving off with more speed than the gravel driveway warranted. Just like that, only Martha and George remained. The auctioneer looked at them with something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. Martha couldn't tell which. "You sure you want to do this? I'm obligated to tell you this place needs hundreds of thousands of dollars in repairs just to be safely habitable. The roof alone is probably $50,000. The plumbing hasn't been used in almost 50 years. The electrical system is likely shot. This isn't a house. It's a project that would challenge even an experienced developer." George reached into his jacket and pulled out the checkbook, the one they'd maintained together for 52 years. "What's the minimum bid?" $1,000. He wrote the check carefully, his hand steadier than Martha would have expected, filling in the amount both numerically and spelled out, signing his name with the same careful penmanship he'd learned in grade school 70 years ago. The auctioneer took it, examined it like she was surprised it didn't bounce just from looking at it, then handed them a thick manila envelope. "Keys are in here," she said. "Also deed transfer papers, property maps, survey documents, utility contact information, structural reports from 1974 that are probably outdated but better than nothing." She hesitated, and her expression softened slightly. "Look, I don't know your situation, and it's not my business, but this place, it's more than most people can handle. It's more than most contractors want to handle. You're not young folks. No offense, but are you sure about this?" George folded the envelope and tucked it under his arm. Then he looked at the auctioneer, and Martha saw in his eyes something she hadn't seen in months, maybe years. Purpose. "Then it's a good thing we're not most people," he said quietly. They drove back to the apartment in silence, the envelope sitting between them on the bench seat. Like a secret they weren't ready to share with the world. Like a bomb that was already ticking. When they pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, they saw Rebecca's car already there, parked in their assigned spot. Which meant she'd been waiting. Which meant one of the other children had called her. Which meant this was about to get complicated. She was standing by the door, arms crossed, her expression tight, with barely controlled frustration, mixed with the particular kind of condescending concern that adult children reserve for parents they've decided can't manage their own lives. When George and Martha approached, walking slowly because Martha's hip was aching from the drive and George's knee was acting up, Rebecca stepped forward. "We need to talk," she said. And it wasn't a request. Inside the apartment, Rebecca paced while Martha made tea that nobody would drink, the ritual of hospitality too ingrained to abandon even now. George sat in his chair, the one that fit his body after years of use, the envelope still tucked under his arm like he was protecting something precious. Rebecca finally stopped pacing and turned to face them, her expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. "David called me," she said, her voice rising slightly despite her obvious efforts to stay calm. "He said, you withdrew $1,500 from your account yesterday. In cash. Mom, Dad, we talked about this. We specifically talked about this 3 days ago. You can't just spend money without telling us. We're trying to help you manage your finances responsibly." George's voice was calm. Maybe too calm. "We don't need help managing anything. We needed to buy something." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, and Martha saw the flash of anger before her daughter controlled it, forced it back down into that practiced corporate patience. "Buy what? Exactly. What could you possibly need that costs $1,500 that you didn't discuss with us first?" He pulled the envelope out from under his arm and set it on the coffee table between them with the deliberate care of someone playing their final card. A house. For a long moment, perhaps 5 full seconds that felt like minutes, Rebecca just stared at the envelope. Then she picked it up, opened it with fingers that shook slightly, and pulled out the deed. Martha watched her daughter's face go through several colors, white to pink to red and back to white again. When she spoke, her voice had climbed an entire octave. "You bought a mansion?" She looked up at them, her eyes wide. "You bought a condemned mansion in Riverside Heights with money you don't have to spare? Are you insane? Have you completely lost your minds?" Martha spoke quietly, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "We bought a home. A place that's ours. A place where we can live on our own terms." Rebecca turned on her, and Martha saw something in her daughter's eyes she'd never seen before, not directed at her. Contempt, mixed with fear, mixed with anger that couldn't be contained anymore. "That's not a home, Mom. That's a death trap. That's a building that's been abandoned for almost 50 years. She looked back at the papers, her hands shaking as she rifled through them. "The roof is failing. There's no heat, no plumbing, no electricity. What were you thinking? What possible justification could you have for this?" George stood slowly, his joints protesting but his back straight. "Rebecca, we raised you and your brothers and sister. We put all 4 of you through college without you having to take loans. We helped you buy your first house. We've made decisions our entire lives. Good ones. Smart ones. This is a good decision. This is a good decision? Rebecca's voice broke on the last word. This is throwing away your future on a pile of rubble. This is proof that you're not capable of making rational choices anymore. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling David and Linda and Thomas. We're not going to let you do this. We'll stop the sale. We'll get a lawyer. We'll prove you're not competent to manage your own affairs. Martha's voice was soft but carried steel that surprised even her. You're not going to let us? We're your parents, Rebecca. We're adults who have lived 73 and 76 years successfully. You don't get to let us do anything. We get to make our own choices. Rebecca caught herself, seemed to realize she'd gone too far, and softened her tone in that calculated way that made Martha's skin crawl. I didn't mean it like that. We care about you. We love you. We want you safe and taken care of. This mansion, it's dangerous. What if you get hurt? What if something happens and you're out there alone with no neighbors, no help, no support? Safe, George repeated, the word hanging in the air. You want us quiet. You want us out of the way. You want us to stop being a responsibility you have to think about. Riverside Gardens is 20 minutes from Thomas's house. But how often does he visit us now? Once a month? Once every 2 months? You want us where someone else is responsible. Where you can tell yourselves we're being cared for without actually having to do any of the caring yourselves. Rebecca's face flushed red, her composure cracking. That's not fair. We're busy. We have jobs, families, responsibilities. We can't drop everything every time you need something. We're not asking you to, Martha said gently. We're asking you to let us live our own lives while we still can. To respect that we're still capable of making our own decisions. To trust that we know ourselves better than you know us. Rebecca left without another word, the door closing behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam, more final. Martha and George stood in the quiet apartment, surrounded by 52 years of accumulated life, photographs of children and grandchildren on every surface, furniture they'd bought piece by piece, memories soaked into every corner. And they both knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. They spent the next week packing. Not everything, just what mattered. Clothes for all seasons, the photographs that told their story, George's tools from the small storage unit, wrenches and hammers and levels that he'd accumulated over decades, each one a memory of something built or fixed. Martha's sewing kit, with needles and thread in every color. The wedding china they'd never used, still in boxes in the back of the closet. The quilt Martha's grandmother had made in 1932, worn thin but irreplaceable. Their children called repeatedly, sometimes together in conference calls where all 4 voices talked over each other. David threatened legal action and named lawyers. Linda cried and begged them to reconsider. Thomas tried a softer approach, asking them to just wait a few months, to think it through more carefully. Rebecca showed up twice more, once with brochures for different facilities, once with a doctor she'd convinced to do a house call to assess their mental state. The doctor, a kind woman in her 40s, sat with Martha and George for an hour. She asked questions, ran simple cognitive tests, checked their blood pressure and heart rates. At the end, she looked at Rebecca and shook her head. Your parents are completely competent. They're making an unconventional choice, certainly, but they understand the risks and consequences. I can't, and won't, declare them unfit to make their own decisions. But Martha and George had already decided anyway. They had spent their whole lives being reasonable, being careful, being exactly what parents were supposed to be, self-sacrificing and supportive, and always putting their children first. Now it was time to be brave, even if brave meant being called foolish. Now it was time to choose themselves, even if it meant their children thought they'd lost their minds. Moving day arrived cold and grey. Clouds, hanging low, and threatening rain. They rented a small truck from the U-Haul place on Highway 9, just a 10-footer that cost $49.95 for the day. They loaded it themselves, refusing help from neighbors who watched from windows with concerned faces, and whispered to each other about those poor old people making such a terrible mistake. Box by box, piece by piece, they carried their chosen possessions down the stairs. George's back ached. Martha had to stop and rest 3 times, sitting on the stairs and catching her breath. But they did it together, the way they'd done everything for 52 years. The drive to the mansion felt longer this time, heavy with finality, and the weight of a choice that couldn't be undone. When they pulled up the broken driveway, the gravel crunching under the truck's tires, the house looked even more imposing than before. Storm clouds had turned the afternoon dark, and the mansion sat against that grey sky like something out of a Gothic novel. Its dark windows like hollow eyes, its stone walls weathered by time and neglect, its towers reaching up into threatening clouds. Martha sat in the truck for a moment after George turned off the engine, just staring at what they'd bought. "What if they're right?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if we're making a terrible mistake? What if this kills us?" George took her hand, their fingers interlacing automatically after 52 years of practice. "Then we'll die doing something we chose. On our own terms, in our own home. That's more than most people get." They climbed out of the truck and approached the front steps. The stone was uneven beneath their feet, cracked and lifted by decades of frost and thaw, of nature working patiently to tear down what humans had built. George fit the heavy iron key into the lock, and it turned more smoothly than he expected, as if the house had been waiting for them. The door opened with a groan that echoed through the empty hall beyond, a sound that seemed to come from the house itself, welcoming or warning. Martha couldn't tell which. They stepped inside, and the world changed. The entrance hall soared 3 stories high, a space larger than their entire apartment. A grand staircase swept upward into shadows, its carved banister dusty but still beautiful. Dust floated in the grey light streaming through broken windows, dancing like tiny ghosts in the air. The marble floors were covered with decades of debris, leaves and dirt, and the crumbled remnants of plaster that had fallen from the ceiling. The air smelled of time itself, of old wood and stone and secrets kept too long, of abandonment and patience. Their footsteps echoed on marble as they walked deeper into the house, each sound bouncing back from high ceilings. Room after room opened before them, each one larger than the last, each one a testament to excess and ambition. A ballroom with a collapsed chandelier in the center, thousands of crystals scattered across the floor like frozen tears. A library with empty, built-in shelves stretching to a ceiling 20 feet high. A dining room that could seat 30 people around a table that was long gone. A kitchen with an ancient iron stove and a fireplace big enough to roast an entire pig. 14 bedrooms on the upper floors, most with fireplaces, many with ceilings that showed signs of water damage from the failing roof. Bathrooms with clawfoot tubs and pull-chain toilets. Servants' quarters tucked into the back corners. Closets the size of modern bedrooms. The house was a ruin. Yes, but it was also magnificent. A testament to an age when people built things to last forever, even when forever proved shorter than expected. when craftsmanship mattered more than cost. When buildings were meant to outlive their builders. That first night, they slept in what had once been the morning room, a space on the first floor that still had most of its windows intact. They laid out sleeping bags they'd brought from camping trips taken decades ago, set up a battery-powered lantern, and huddled together on the hard floor. Outside, the wind moaned through broken windows somewhere in the vast house. Inside, the building settled around them with creaks and groans and whispers, the sound of old wood adjusting, of a house that had been alone for almost 50 years, suddenly having company again. They should have been terrified, two elderly people alone in a crumbling mansion miles from help. Instead, they felt something else entirely. They felt alive, more alive than they'd felt in the cramped safety of their apartment, more alive than they'd felt in years of being managed and monitored, and treated like children who couldn't be trusted. The next morning, George woke at dawn and began his exploration in earnest. He walked every room, every hallway, every corner of the mansion that he could safely access, taking notes in a spiral notebook he'd bought specifically for this purpose. The house was even larger than he'd realized, more complex. There were servants' staircases hidden behind walls, narrow and steep, dumbwaiter shafts that descended into darkness, doors that opened to closets the size of bedrooms, storage rooms, pantries, a wine cellar, a coal room, a scullery. In one upstairs hallway, he found a door that wouldn't open, the lock rusted solid, the wood swollen in its frame. He made a note to come back with oil and a pry bar. Something about that door bothered him. The way it sat in the wall, the way the hallway seemed to dead-end too soon. But there were 100 other things demanding attention. And he moved on. Martha started in the kitchen, which was enormous. Built for a staff of cooks and scullery maids who would have prepared elaborate meals for guests who arrived in carriages and later automobiles. She found copper pots green with age, cast iron trivets, a butcher block table that must have weighed 500 pounds, sinks deep enough to bathe a child in, shelves that held nothing but dust and the ghosts of meals served a century ago. She set up their small camp stove on one of the counters, filled a pot with water from the bottles they'd brought, and made coffee. And standing in that enormous kitchen with sunlight streaming through windows they'd need to repair, steam rising from her cup, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. She felt useful. She felt needed. She felt like she had purpose beyond just existing, beyond just waiting to be too much trouble. By noon, they had made a plan. The kind of plan that would have seemed insane to their children, that was insane even to them if they were being honest. They would focus on making 3 rooms livable first. The morning room where they'd slept, turning it into their bedroom. The kitchen, getting at least basic functionality. And 1 bathroom on the main floor, something with running water and a working toilet. Get those spaces functional, then expand outward. It would take time. It would take money they barely had. It would take work that their bodies might not be able to handle. But they had something more valuable than money or strength or youth. They had each other. They had determination. And they had all the time in the world because no one was going to put them in a home now. No one was going to make them give up this place they'd chosen. This last great adventure. This final act of defiance against a world that wanted them to fade quietly away. The days fell into a rhythm. George worked on repairs, starting with the broken windows in their bedroom, measuring and cutting salvaged glass from other parts of the house, carefully fitting each pane and sealing it with putty mixed by hand. Martha cleaned, sweeping decades of dust and leaves and mouse droppings, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees until her back screamed and her fingers bled from the harsh soap she used. They ate simple meals from cans heated on the camp stove. They fell into exhausted sleep each night, their muscles aching in ways they hadn't ached in years, but also feeling used, feeling purposeful. They didn't talk about their children, who hadn't called since moving day. They didn't talk about the impossibility of what they were attempting. They just worked, day after day, two old people in a falling-down mansion, refusing to quit. And then, 3 weeks in, they had their first visitor. A truck pulled up the driveway one Thursday morning, tires crunching on gravel that George had spent 2 days raking smooth. Martha heard it first from inside the kitchen, where she was scrubbing century-old grime from the massive cast-iron stove. Her shoulders aching from the repetitive motion, she straightened slowly, one hand pressed to her lower back, and peered through the window she'd cleaned just yesterday, the glass finally clear enough to see through after being opaque with dirt for decades. An elderly black man in work clothes climbed out of a faded blue pickup that looked older than some of the trees surrounding the property. He stood for a moment, looking up at the mansion, his weathered face thoughtful, then walked toward the front door with the slow, deliberate gait of someone whose body had earned every year. Martha met him at the door, wiping her hands on the apron she'd found in a drawer. Yellowed with age, but still serviceable. He removed his hat, revealing white hair cut close to his skull. "My name's Earl Watson," he said, his voice deep and warm like summer thunder rolling in from far away. "I live about 2 miles down the road, other side of the hill. Heard someone had finally bought the Ashford place. Figured I'd come see if the rumors were true." George appeared from upstairs, dust in his hair and cobwebs clinging to his shirt. Earl looked between them, taking in their ages, their worn clothes, the exhaustion evident in the way they held themselves. Then he smiled, and it crinkled his whole face. "You're doing good work," he said simply. "Could use some help, though, if you don't mind an old man poking around." Earl was 82. They learned, over coffee made on their camp stove, while sitting on folding chairs in what would someday be a proper kitchen. He'd been a carpenter for 60 years, worked on restorations all over the state before his wife passed 5 years ago, and he'd retired to a small house with a workshop that stayed mostly empty now. He looked around at what Martha and George had accomplished in 3 weeks, and nodded slowly. "You've got good instincts," he told them. "Fixing windows before winter. Smart. Getting water flowing to the kitchen. Necessary. But that plaster work in the morning room," he shook his head gently, "that's not going to hold. Wrong kind of mixture. Too much water. It'll crack by spring." George's face fell slightly. "I followed the instructions from a book I got at the library." Earl chuckled. "Books are fine, but books don't tell you about the humidity in old stone buildings or how plaster behaves different depending on what's behind it." He stood up, joints creaking audibly. "Let me show you. Bring your bucket." From that day on, Earl came 3 times a week, sometimes 4. He taught George how to properly mix plaster, the exact ratio of lime to sand to water, how to test the consistency by feel. He showed Martha which floorboards could be saved with sanding and which needed replacing entirely, how to spot dry rot versus surface damage. He brought tools from his workshop, things George didn't have, levels and planes and clamps that had been used for decades and still worked perfectly. He never asked for payment. When they tried to insist, pressing $20 bills into his hands, he just smiled and gave the money back. "I've got nothing but time, and a workshop full of tools gathering dust. Beats watching television, and waiting to die. Besides, he added, looking up at the mansion's facade with something like reverence, this place deserves to stand. It's got stories to tell, built by people who knew how to build things that last. With Earl's help, progress accelerated. By the end of October, they had 3 rooms fully functional. The morning room was now their bedroom. Plaster repaired properly, 2 windows replaced, a space heater connected to a generator. Earl had helped them install. The kitchen had running water from a well. Earl had located and helped them reconnect. Cold only, but it was water. And they had 1 bathroom working. The toilet occasionally temperamental but mostly reliable. A small triumph that made Martha cry with relief the first time she flushed it successfully. But as they worked, Martha began noticing things. Strange things. The kind of details you only see when you're spending every day intimately acquainted with a building's bones. In the library, a massive room on the first floor with built-in shelves stretching 20 feet high, she noticed the wood paneling on one wall was different. Not obviously so, but subtly. The grain pattern didn't quite match. The stain was almost, but not exactly the same shade. The molding was slightly more ornate than the molding in the rest of the room, like someone had tried very hard to make it blend, but couldn't quite get it perfect. She mentioned it to George one evening over dinner. Canned soup, heated on their now reliable stove. He came to look, running his hands over the wood, his machinist's fingers trained to detect tiny variations. "You're right," he said. "This whole section was added later. Much later. Maybe 1920s based on the style." "Why would you add paneling to match existing paneling?" Martha wondered. "Unless you were trying to hide something." Earl heard about it when he came the next day and went to examine the wall himself. He tapped it in several places, listening to the sound. "Hollow," he said. "There's space behind here. Could be a lot of space based on how it echoes." George went outside and paced the exterior of the library, counting steps, then came back inside and paced the interior. He pulled out his notebook and did some quick calculations. "There's at least 10 feet missing," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "The outside wall is 10 feet further out than this paneling. There's a whole section of room that's been sealed off." They spent hours examining that wall, looking for any kind of opening, any indication of how to access whatever was behind it. They found nothing. No visible seams except the one Martha had noticed. No handles, no locks, nothing. Just smooth wood paneling that looked almost, but not quite like it had always been there. That night, Martha couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that wall, about the space behind it, about why someone would go to such trouble to hide it. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went to the small desk they'd set up in the corner of their bedroom. She opened George's laptop, the one their grandson had given him 3 Christmases ago that he barely knew how to use, and typed "Charles Ashford Railroad Baron" into the search box. What she found kept her reading until dawn. Charles Ashford had built his fortune in the 1880s, connecting eastern markets to western territories. He'd been ruthless, buying up smaller rail lines, crushing competition, bribing politicians, everything the robber barons did in that Gilded Age. He'd built this mansion in 1887 as a summer retreat, a place to display his wealth and power. 43 rooms, staff of 20. Parties that lasted for days with guests arriving from New York and Boston and Philadelphia. But in 1906, everything changed. A massive investigation into railroad monopolies and stock manipulation swept through the industry. Several magnates were indicted. Ashford was questioned extensively but never formally charged. Protected by lawyers and carefully destroyed evidence and convenient deaths of potential witnesses. But his reputation was ruined. His fortune, built on schemes that even in that age of corruption were considered excessive, began to crumble. He died in 1904, before the worst of the scandal broke. His son inherited the estate and tried to maintain it, but by 1920, the money was running out. The son died in 1938. The grandson held on until 1976, living alone in the vast mansion with no staff, no maintenance, just slowly declining, until he died of a heart attack, and was found 3 days later by a mailman who noticed the smell. The property went to the county for unpaid taxes, and there it sat for 49 years until Martha and George bought it for $1,500. But what caught Martha's attention was a small paragraph in a newspaper article from 1923. The Ashford family denies rumors of a secret art collection. Despite speculation by several galleries and collectors, no significant works have been located at the estate. Family representatives claim any valuable pieces were sold years ago to settle debts. An art collection, hidden, valuable enough that galleries were looking for it. Never found. Martha stared at that paragraph for a long time. Then she looked at the photograph of Charles Ashford that accompanied the article. A stern man with a thick mustache and cold eyes. "What did you hide?" she whispered to the screen. "And why?" She showed George and Earl her research over breakfast. Earl leaned back in his chair and whistled low. Art collection worth hiding. Wall sealed sometime in the 1920s when the money was running out and people were looking for assets to seize. He looked at the two of them. You might have bought more than just a house. They decided to keep searching but also to keep quiet. If there was something valuable behind that wall, the last thing they needed was word getting out before they knew what they had. The last thing they needed was their children finding out and using it as more ammunition to declare them incompetent. But their children were already preparing their next attack. It came on a cold Monday morning in early November. Martha was in the library, continuing her examination of the suspicious wall, when she heard cars coming up the driveway. Multiple cars. She looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. David's Mercedes, Rebecca's Lexus, Linda's SUV, and a fourth car she didn't recognize, a black sedan with tinted windows. "George," she called, her voice tight. "They're here." The children entered without knocking, treating the mansion like it was already theirs to access. They brought with them a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Patricia Carmichael from Carmichael and Associates. She carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Martha's wedding dress had. "We need to discuss your living situation," Rebecca said without preamble, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced patience that Martha had come to dread. "You've been here 6 weeks. We've given you time to realize this was a mistake. Now, it's time to be practical." David stepped forward, pulling papers from his own briefcase. "We've filed a petition with the county court, requesting conservatorship based on financial incompetence and unsafe living conditions. We have documentation of your reckless spending, your isolation in an unfit dwelling, your refusal to accept reasonable assistance." The lawyer, Patricia, spoke in a clipped professional voice. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, your children are concerned about your welfare. This property is not suitable for persons of your age and physical condition. The court will likely agree that you require protective oversight." George stood very still, his hands clenched at his sides. "Get out of our house." Linda tried a softer approach, tears already forming in her eyes. "Mommy, Daddy, please, we're so worried about you. This place is falling apart. You're killing yourselves trying to fix it. Why can't you just come stay with one of us while we sort this out? Because you don't want us to stay with you, Martha said quietly. You want us in a facility where we're someone else's responsibility, where you can visit twice a year and tell yourselves you're good children. Thomas, who had been silent, finally spoke. The petition goes before Judge Morrison next Wednesday. We have medical experts prepared to testify about the risks you're taking. We have photographs of the property's condition. We have financial records showing irresponsible spending. Mom, Dad, you're going to lose. The court is going to appoint us conservators. You'll lose control of your finances and this property, unless, Patricia, the lawyer, interjected smoothly, you agree to voluntary supervised management. Sign over power of attorney. Allow your children to sell this property and relocate to appropriate housing. The court would look favorably on a family resolution. Never, George said, the word dropping like a stone in the quiet library. Then we'll see you in court, David said. And they left, the door closing with finality. Martha and George stood in the empty library, the enormity of what they were facing settling over them like a heavy blanket. They could lose everything: the house, their independence, their freedom. After only 6 weeks of trying to build something of their own, Earl found them there an hour later, still standing in the same spot, paralyzed by fear and fury. He listened to their account of the visit, his weathered face growing more serious with each detail. Then he pulled out his phone. I know some people, he said. People who might be able to help. The first person Earl called was Pastor Michaels from the Baptist church 3 miles down the road. She arrived that afternoon, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a backbone of steel. She listened to their story, took notes, and nodded. I'll make some calls, she said. There are people in this community who remember what it's like to be dismissed and underestimated. People who might want to help. The second person was Harold Chen, a retired museum curator who lived 2 towns over and had a reputation for knowing everything about art and history and preservation in the region. He was intrigued by Martha's research about Charles Ashford and agreed to come look at the mansion. The third was Victoria Mason, a lawyer who specialized in elder rights and had built her career defending seniors from predatory family members and corrupt conservatorships. She charged reasonable rates and had never lost a case involving competent adults being railroaded by their own children. By the end of the week, Martha and George had assembled their own team. It wasn't much compared to the resources their children commanded, but it was something. It was support. It was validation that they weren't crazy for fighting. Victoria came to the mansion on Thursday and spent 3 hours documenting everything. She photographed the repairs George had made, interviewed Earl about their competence and decision-making, took notes on their daily routines and financial management. She was particularly interested in the research Martha had done about the mansion's history. This shows initiative and intellectual engagement, Victoria said, flipping through Martha's carefully organized notes. This is not the behavior of incompetent people. This is the behavior of curious, active minds pursuing a reasonable project. Can we win? George asked. Victoria looked at him seriously. You have a harder fight because you're old. Courts tend to be paternalistic toward elderly people, assuming they need protection. But you're clearly competent. You've been managing this property responsibly with appropriate help, and you have legitimate reasons for your choices. Yes, we can win. It won't be easy, but we can win. Pastor Michaels made good on her promise. Within days, members of the community began appearing at the mansion. a retired contractor named Bill, who spent a day helping George repair the front porch steps. 2 women from the church who brought cleaning supplies and spent hours helping Martha scrub the ballroom. A young couple who owned a hardware store and donated paint and brushes and offered advice on the plumbing. Word spread through the small community, carried on the wind of church bulletins and coffee shop conversations, and the particular way that news travels in rural places, where everyone knows everyone. The elderly couple fixing up the Ashford place. Their own children trying to take it away. The underdog story that people love, especially people who've spent their own lives being underestimated. Harold Chen, the retired curator, came on a Saturday morning and spent hours examining the mansion. He was particularly fascinated by the library wall that had captured Martha's attention. He ran his hands over the wood paneling, tapped it in several places, pulled out a small flashlight, and examined the seams. "This is definitely a later addition," he confirmed. 1920s, maybe early 30s based on the wood type and joinery methods. Someone went to considerable expense to seal this space. The craftsmanship is excellent, which means they wanted it to last, but also to be undetectable. "Why?" Martha asked. Harold smiled. "That's the interesting question, isn't it?" In the 1920s, during Prohibition, some wealthy families built hidden rooms for storing illegal alcohol. But this doesn't have the markers of a liquor cache. The location is wrong, the size is wrong. He paused. Charles Ashford was known to be an art collector. Contemporary accounts mention a significant collection of American paintings. But no inventory was ever found after his death. "You think it's behind this wall," George said. Harold shrugged. "I think something is behind this wall, something someone thought was worth hiding very carefully." They decided to wait until after the court hearing. If they won, if they kept control of the property, then they could explore further. If they lost, well, it wouldn't matter what was behind the wall, because they wouldn't be there to find out. The days leading up to the hearing were tense. Martha barely slept, lying awake at night, listening to the house settle around them, wondering if these would be their last nights in this place they'd already come to love. George threw himself into work, repairing things with an almost desperate energy, as if making the house more livable would somehow prove they deserved to stay. Their children called repeatedly, each conversation following the same pattern, offers to help that were really demands for surrender, threats of what the court would do, pleas wrapped in manipulation about how they were only thinking of their parents' welfare. Rebecca showed up unannounced one evening with a photographer. "For the court," she said, "to document the unsafe conditions." George blocked the door and refused entry. "You'll need a warrant to come back here." The night before the hearing, Earl and Pastor Michaels and Victoria Mason all came to the house. They sat around the kitchen table, the one surface George had managed to restore to something like its original glory, and went over their strategy. Victoria would present their case, demonstrate their competence, counter every argument the children made. Earl and Pastor Michaels would testify as character witnesses. Harold had prepared a written statement about the historical value of the property and the responsible way Martha and George were approaching its restoration. But underlying everything was fear. Fear that the system would side with the children because they were younger, wealthier, more articulate. Fear that being old would be seen as being incompetent, regardless of the evidence. Fear that this fight would end the way so many fights end for elderly people, with their choices stripped away and their remaining years managed by others. Martha went to bed that night and prayed for the first time in years, not to any particular God, but to the universe itself, to whatever force governs justice and dignity and the rights of people to live their own lives. "Please," she whispered into the darkness. "Please let us keep this. Please let us keep ourselves." The courthouse was a granite building in the county seat, imposing and cold. Martha and George arrived early with Victoria. Climbing the steps slowly, both of them dressed in their best clothes, outfits they hadn't worn since their grandson's wedding 2 years ago. They looked like what they were: elderly people trying very hard to appear competent and capable, and not at all like the confused, declining individuals their children would paint them as. The courtroom was smaller than Martha expected, wood-paneled and formal. Their children were already there with their lawyer, Patricia. All 4 of them in expensive suits, looking prosperous and concerned, and reasonable, looking like responsible adults, trying to protect their declining parents. Martha felt a spike of rage, so pure it almost took her breath away. Judge Morrison entered. A woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes behind reading glasses. "Everyone rise," the bailiff intoned. And they did, the scraping of chairs loud in the quiet room. The hearing began. Patricia Carmichael laid out the children's case with professional precision. 2 individuals in their 70s who had impulsively purchased an uninhabitable property, who had withdrawn a significant portion of their limited savings for this reckless investment, who were now living in dangerous conditions, isolated from family and medical care, stubbornly refusing reasonable assistance, who showed signs of impaired judgment and needed protective oversight before they hurt themselves or depleted their remaining resources. She called David to testify. He spoke about the late-night phone call when his mother had fallen, his father's inability to help her, about their refusal to accept help or even discuss alternatives, about his fear that he would get a call one day saying one or both of them had been seriously injured or worse. Linda testified next, crying as she described visiting the mansion and seeing the conditions they were living in. No proper heat, limited water, a structure with a failing roof and crumbling plaster. Her elderly parents sleeping on the floor in sleeping bags like homeless people. Rebecca talked about financial irresponsibility. The $1,500 spent on a property worth nothing. The continued spending on supplies and repairs. About her parents' inability to understand the scope of what they'd taken on, or the impossibility of completing it at their age. Thomas brought photographs, images of the mansion from outside, carefully framed to show only the worst damage. The sagging roof and broken windows, making the place look like it should be condemned rather than lived in. Patricia Carmichael summarized with devastating effectiveness. "Your Honor, these are good people who dedicated their lives to their children and grandchildren. They deserve dignity and safety in their remaining years. But they are no longer capable of providing that for themselves. They need help, and their loving children are prepared to provide it. We ask the court to grant conservatorship so this family can work together to ensure Mr. and Mrs. Hayes receive the care they need and deserve." Then it was Victoria Mason's turn. She stood slowly, deliberately, letting the courtroom wait. She called no witnesses first. Instead, she played a video. It showed Martha and George at work in the mansion. George carefully measuring and cutting glass for a window repair, his movements precise and confident. Martha mixing plaster with Earl, following his instructions exactly, learning a new skill at 73, both of them consulting building plans, making lists, solving problems together. "These are not confused, declining individuals," Victoria said. "These are competent adults, engaged in a challenging but reasonable project, learning new skills, making thoughtful decisions, building something meaningful." She called Earl Watson to the stand. He testified about his 3 months working with Martha and George, about their intelligence and capability, their willingness to learn and adapt, their sound judgment about what they could do themselves versus when they needed help. Have you ever seen any sign of mental incompetence? Victoria asked. Never, Earl said firmly. They're sharper than most people half their age. They just chose something difficult. That's not incompetence. That's courage. Pastor Michaels testified about the community support Martha and George had garnered, about the volunteers helping with restoration, about how they'd become part of the social fabric rather than isolated and declining. Victoria presented financial records showing that Martha and George had spent their money responsibly, budgeting carefully, not depleting their savings recklessly, but investing in something that was legally theirs. She presented the historical research Martha had done, the careful notes and organization, the intellectual engagement. She called George to the stand. He spoke quietly, but clearly, about why they'd bought the mansion, about refusing to be warehoused, about wanting to prove they still mattered, about choosing to work hard rather than fade away comfortably. Then Martha testified. She talked about the intervention, about how her children had made her feel like a burden that needed managing rather than a person who deserved respect, about the choice between Riverside Gardens and the mansion, between managed decline and purposeful struggle, about how these last 3 months had been hard but also the most alive she'd felt in years. Your Honor, Victoria said in her closing argument, this case isn't about safety or finances. It's about control. These children want to make choices for their parents because those choices would be easier for the children. They want their parents in a facility not because it's what's best for Martha and George, but because it's what's most convenient for David and Rebecca and Linda and Thomas. She paused. But convenience is not grounds for conservatorship. Martha and George Hayes are competent adults making unconventional but reasonable choices about their own lives. They have that right. The court should not take it away. Judge Morrison called a recess. For 90 minutes, Martha and George sat in the hallway with Victoria, waiting. Earl brought them coffee. Pastor Michaels sat with them, holding Martha's hand. When they were called back in, Judge Morrison looked at both families for a long moment before speaking. I've reviewed all the testimony and evidence. This court finds that Martha and George Hayes are mentally competent to manage their own affairs. The petition for conservatorship is denied. The courtroom erupted. David stood up shouting. Rebecca started crying. Linda looked stunned. Thomas just put his head in his hands. However, Judge Morrison continued, her voice cutting through the noise. I am ordering a follow-up evaluation in 6 months. This court will verify that the living conditions at the property have improved to a safe standard and that Mr. and Mrs. Hayes continue to demonstrate sound judgment. If there is evidence of decline or unsafe conditions at that time, this matter will be reconsidered. She looked directly at Martha and George. You have won the right to make your own choices. Use that right wisely. Take care of yourselves and your property. Prove that the trust this court is placing in you is justified. Outside the courthouse, their children confronted them one final time. This isn't over, David said, his face red with anger and humiliation. In 6 months, the judge will see what we see, that you're in over your heads. Maybe, George replied. Or maybe you'll see what we see, that we're still capable of more than you give us credit for. The drive back to the mansion felt different, lighter. They had won, not permanently but significantly. They had 6 months to prove themselves, 6 months to show that old age didn't mean incompetence, 6 months to turn a crumbling mansion into something livable, 6 months to discover what was hidden behind that library wall. That night, They celebrated with Earl and Pastor Michaels and Victoria Mason and a dozen other people from the community who had supported them. They ate pizza that Bill the contractor had brought. Sitting on folding chairs in the grand ballroom, with its mostly swept floor and partially repaired ceiling. It wasn't fancy. The house was still more ruin than residence. But it was theirs. And for the first time in months, maybe years, Martha and George felt truly free. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. After the celebration ended, and everyone had gone home, Martha and George stood together in the library, staring at the wall that had captivated their attention for weeks. The house was quiet except for the wind outside and the settling sounds they'd learned to recognize as normal. Tomorrow, George said, we figure out how to open that wall. Martha nodded. Tomorrow, we find out what Charles Ashford thought was worth hiding for 100 years. They didn't know yet that behind that wall was something that would change not just their lives but their entire understanding of what they'd bought, what they'd fought for, and what they were worth. They didn't know that the real story was just beginning, that the mansion held secrets valuable beyond anything they could imagine. But they knew they had 6 months. 6 months to prove themselves. 6 months to restore a mansion. 6 months to show the world and their children and themselves that they were still capable of extraordinary things. And somewhere behind that sealed wall, buried in darkness for nearly a century, $230 million worth of history waited to be discovered. Waited for the right people to find it. Waited for Martha and George Hayes. The morning after their court victory, Martha woke before dawn, her body so accustomed to early rising after 73 years that sleeping late felt impossible, even when exhaustion made her bones ache. George was already up, sitting at the small table they'd set up in the morning room, surrounded by papers and sketches he'd been making of the library wall. His reading glasses sat crooked on his nose, and he had that particular expression of intense concentration she'd learned to recognize over 52 years, the look that meant he was solving a problem piece by piece in his mind. I think I know how to open it, he said without looking up. Or, at least where to start looking. Martha poured coffee from the pot George had already brewed, the smell filling their bedroom with warmth and normalcy. Tell me. He pushed his sketches toward her. The paneling. It's all decorative molding and carved details. But there's one section, right here, where the carving is different. It's the same pattern but reversed. Like looking in a mirror. That's not a mistake. Craftsmen don't make that kind of mistake. Not on expensive work like this. It's deliberate. It's a marker. Martha studied the sketch, then thought back to all the times she'd run her fingers over that wall. He was right. There was one rosette carved into the molding that spiraled the opposite direction from all the others. She'd noticed it weeks ago but thought it was just a quirk, a moment when the carver's attention had wandered. You think it's a release mechanism? She said. Only one way to find out. They went to the library still in their pajamas, unable to wait even long enough to dress properly. The house was cold in the early November morning, their breath visible in the air, frost coating the windows they hadn't yet replaced. But neither of them noticed the temperature. They were too focused on that wall, on the possibility of what lay behind it, on the answer to questions that had consumed them for weeks. George approached the reversed rosette carefully, as if sudden movement might somehow seal the wall forever. He pressed it gently. Nothing happened. He tried twisting it. Still nothing. Then he pushed it inward while twisting, and they both heard a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire house, through their entire bodies. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then, with a sound like a long-held breath finally being released, a section of the paneling shifted. Not much, just an inch, but enough to create a seam where before there had been seamless wood. Enough to show that behind the beautiful paneling was darkness, space, possibility. Martha's hand found George's, their fingers interlacing automatically. Together, George pulled on the edge of the panel, and it swung outward smoothly despite decades of disuse. The hinges hidden within the wall somehow still functional. Behind it was a narrow corridor, perhaps 3 feet wide, stretching back into darkness. The walls were plain plaster, unfinished, utilitarian. This space had never been meant to be seen, never meant to be admired. It was purely functional, built to hide something from the world. The air that flowed out was dry and stale, but not unpleasant, not musty or rotten. It smelled like old paper and dust and time sealed away. Martha felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she wondered if George could hear it. "I'll get flashlights," George said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make this discovery disappear. He returned with 2 flashlights and their jackets, because the air coming from the corridor was even colder than the house. They stepped through the opening together, their beams of light pushing back shadows that had existed for almost a century. The corridor extended about 20 feet, then turned. They followed it, their footsteps echoing softly, until they came to a door. This door wasn't hidden or disguised. It was heavy oak with an iron handle, the kind of door that meant something important lay beyond. George tried the handle. Locked. He examined the lock closely, shining his light directly on it. "This isn't original to the house," he said. "This was added later, probably 1920s based on the style. Someone sealed this deliberately, wanted to make sure whatever was inside stayed protected." "Can you open it?" Martha asked. George pulled out his wallet and extracted a thin piece of metal he'd carried for 40 years. A lockpick he'd made when he was young and foolish, and had never quite brought himself to throw away. He worked the lock for several minutes, his fingers remembering skills he hadn't used in decades. Finally, another click. This one, more substantial, more final. The door swung open, and they stepped into a room that took their breath away. It was perhaps 20 feet deep and 12 feet wide. A decent-sized room hidden within the walls of the mansion. But the size wasn't what made them gasp. It was the contents. Every wall was lined with wooden racks and shelves, and on those shelves, wrapped carefully in cloth, were shapes. Dozens of them. Maybe more than 50. Rectangular shapes, various sizes, all wrapped in what looked like muslin that had yellowed with age but remained intact. Martha's hands shook as she reached for the nearest package. It was about 2 feet by 3 feet, substantial but manageable. She unwrapped it slowly, carefully, the fabric crackling slightly as she pulled it away. And underneath was a painting, even in the dim light from their flashlights. It was extraordinary. A woman sitting in a garden, afternoon light, falling across her dress in shades of gold and cream. The brushwork was loose but confident, impressionistic, each stroke visible and purposeful. In the bottom right corner, barely visible, was a signature that made Martha's breath catch. Mary Cassatt, 1889. George leaned closer, his flashlight illuminating the painting more fully. "Is that real?" Martha didn't answer. She was already reaching for another package, larger this time. She unwrapped it to reveal a seascape, dramatic and moody, waves crashing against rocks under a turbulent sky. The signature read Winslow Homer, 1891. "Oh my God," George whispered. They moved through the room like people in a dream, unwrapping painting after painting, each one more remarkable than the last. American masters from the Gilded Age. Names Martha recognized from the art history books she'd pored over in libraries when she was young, before children and bills and survival had consumed all her time and energy. John Singer Sargent. A portrait of a young woman in white, luminous and alive. James McNeill Whistler. A nocturne in shades of blue and grey that seemed to glow with inner light. Albert Pinkham Ryder. A moonlit landscape that was almost abstract in its simplicity. Childe Hassam. William Merritt Chase. Thomas Eakins. Name after name that belonged in museums, in textbooks, in the conversations of people far more educated and wealthy than two elderly people from a small apartment who'd spent their savings on a crumbling mansion. Martha's legs wouldn't hold her anymore. She sat down hard on the floor, surrounded by unwrapped paintings, and tried to understand what they'd found. George sat beside her, his arm automatically going around her shoulders, both of them staring at the treasures revealed by their flashlight beams. "This is Charles Ashford's collection," Martha said, her voice shaky. "The one that disappeared, the one galleries searched for. It was here the whole time, sealed in this room, protected and hidden and waiting. For us," George added quietly. "Waiting for us to find it." They sat in that hidden room for a long time, maybe an hour, just looking at the paintings they'd unwrapped. Neither of them knew enough about art to estimate value, but they knew enough to understand that what they were looking at was significant. These weren't prints or copies. These were original works by artists whose paintings hung in the Metropolitan Museum, the National Gallery, the Smithsonian, and they were sitting in a secret room in a mansion that Martha and George had bought for $1,500. Finally, Martha spoke. "We need to call Harold." Harold Chen arrived within 2 hours, driving faster than was probably safe. Once Earl had called him with the words, "You need to see this right now." He rushed through the house following Earl's directions, barely noticing the restoration work, too focused on getting to the library. When he saw the open panel and the corridor beyond, he stopped dead. "You found it," he breathed. "You actually found it." Martha led him to the hidden room, and his reaction when he saw the paintings was everything theirs had been and more. He stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth open, his eyes moving from painting to painting. Then he pulled out his phone and started taking photographs, documenting everything, his hands shaking so badly that George had to help him steady the camera. "Do you know what this is?" Harold asked, his voice tight with emotion that might have been excitement or fear or both. "This is the Lost Ashford collection. Art historians have speculated about it for 100 years. Charles Ashford was known to be a major patron of American artists. He commissioned works directly from painters. He bought pieces before they became famous. But when he died, the collection disappeared. People assumed it had been sold quietly to pay debts or seized during the railroad investigations or destroyed. But it wasn't. He paused, looking around the room with something like reverence. He preserved it, hid it away where time couldn't touch it, where creditors and investigators couldn't find it. And it's been waiting here ever since. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Harold spent the rest of that day in the hidden room, carefully examining each painting with a jeweler's loupe and a small UV flashlight he'd brought from his car. He checked signatures under magnification, studied brushwork, examined the canvases themselves for age markers and authenticity indicators. By evening, he had looked at 27 paintings, and his preliminary assessment made Martha dizzy. "These are authentic," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Every single one I've examined so far is genuine. Original works, not copies or forgeries. Some of these are documented in historical records as being in Ashford's possession. Others have never been catalogued anywhere, which means they were private commissions that have never been publicly displayed." He looked at Martha and George with an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. "Do you understand what you have here?" Martha shook her head. "Not really." Harold took a deep breath. "Conservative estimate, just based on what I've seen so far, and assuming the rest are of similar quality and authenticity, this collection is worth at minimum $200 million, possibly as much as $300 million. These aren't just paintings. This is a time capsule of American art at its peak. Museums will fight over these. The Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum, the Getty. They'll all want pieces. This will rewrite art history." George felt the room tilt. He sat down heavily in the chair. Earl pushed toward him. "Say that number again." $200 million, Harold repeated. "At least, and that's conservative. If we get these properly authenticated by major auction houses and generate competitive bidding, the value could go even higher." Martha started laughing, and once she started, she couldn't stop. It wasn't funny, exactly, but the absurdity of it overwhelmed every other emotion. They'd spent $1,500 on a mansion their children said was worthless. They'd fought in court to keep a property everyone said was a money pit. And underneath it all, sealed in a hidden room, was wealth beyond anything they'd ever imagined. Wealth beyond what their children in their expensive suits and fancy cars would earn in a dozen lifetimes. George joined her laughter, the two of them sitting in that cold library holding each other while Earl and Harold exchanged worried glances, probably wondering if the shock had broken something in these elderly people's minds. But Martha and George weren't broken. They were vindicated. They were proven right in a way so absolute, so overwhelming. That laughter was the only response that made sense. Harold stayed at the mansion for 3 more days, bringing in specialized equipment from his contacts in the museum world. Cameras and lights and tools for careful examination. He documented every painting, photographed every detail, recorded every signature and date. He worked methodically, treating each piece with reverence, his lifetime of expertise applied to the most significant find of his career. By the end of the 3rd day, he had his final count and assessment. 53 paintings total, 37 by major American artists whose work commanded millions at auction, 16 by lesser-known but still significant painters from the same period, all in remarkable condition, protected by the sealed room's stable temperature and low humidity. All authentic beyond any reasonable doubt, and all legally belonging to Martha and George Hayes, through their purchase of the property and everything within it. His final valuation, delivered in the library with Earl and Pastor Michaels present as witnesses, was specific and devastating. $230 million, Harold said. "That's what Christie's or Sotheby's would estimate for the complete collection at auction. Individual pieces range from $5 million for the smaller works to potentially $40 million for the Sargent portrait. The cassette you unwrapped first is worth approximately $23 million. The Homer Seascape, $18 million. The Whistler Nocturne, $32 million. He paused, letting those numbers sink in. This is one of the most significant private art collections ever discovered. It will make international news. It will change your lives completely. And, he added gently, it will make you targets. For thieves, for your family, for everyone who will suddenly see you differently." Martha and George sat together on the old sofa they'd brought from their apartment, holding hands, trying to process what they were being told. Just weeks ago, their children had called them incompetent, tried to put them in a facility, claimed they couldn't manage their own lives. Now they owned $250 million worth of art, and nothing would ever be the same. "We need a lawyer," George said finally. "A good one. Victoria Mason." They already had from the conservatorship case, but Harold suggested they also needed an art lawyer, someone who specialized in authentication, provenance, and the complex legal issues around discovered collections. He made calls, and within days they had assembled a team. Victoria for family law and elder rights, Marcus Feldman for art law and estate planning, Patricia Wong for security and insurance. Each one came highly recommended, each one willing to work with Martha and George rather than against them. The first order of business was security. The paintings had survived 100 years in that sealed room, but now that they'd been discovered, they were vulnerable. Marcus arranged for a security company to install cameras, alarms, and reinforced locks throughout the mansion. Patricia coordinated with a specialized art storage company to create a climate-controlled vault within the hidden room itself. Nothing would be moved off the property until absolutely necessary, but everything would be protected. The second order of business was authentication through official channels. Harold's assessment was expert and reliable, but for the paintings to be sold or insured or displayed publicly, they needed authentication from recognized authorities. Marcus contacted Sotheby's, and within a week, 3 specialists arrived from New York with equipment and credentials, and the kind of careful professionalism that comes from handling objects worth more than most people will earn in a lifetime. They spent 5 days examining the collection, X-rays to analyze the paint layers and canvas structure, infrared photography to reveal underdrawings and pentimenti, chemical analysis of the paint to verify its age and composition, comparison with known works by the same artists, research into provenance and historical documentation. Their conclusion matched Harold's exactly. Authentic, extraordinary, worth a fortune that most people couldn't even conceptualize. They provided written authentication reports, each one thick as a book, each one representing hours of careful analysis, and they confirmed the valuation, $230 million. Perhaps more, if the right buyers competed. Word began to spread despite everyone's best efforts at secrecy. In a small town, secrets don't keep long, especially secrets involving security companies and New York art specialists and lawyers arriving in expensive cars. Pastor Michaels heard whispers at church. Earl heard rumors at the hardware store. Within 2 weeks, everyone in the community knew that Martha and George had found something valuable in the mansion, though most people's guesses fell far short of the reality. A local newspaper ran a small article, "Local couple discovers art in historic mansion." It was vague on details, but it was enough. By the next morning, journalists were calling. Small regional outlets at first, then larger papers. Television stations from the state capital sent requests for interviews. Someone from CNN left a message. Marcus advised silence until they were ready to go public on their own terms. But controlling the narrative was impossible. The story was too good, too compelling. Elderly couple buys condemned mansion, fights their own children in court, discovers hidden treasure worth hundreds of millions. It had every element that made stories go viral. Underdogs, family drama, enormous wealth, vindication. 3 weeks after they'd opened the hidden room, Martha and George woke to find cars lining the road leading to their property. News vans with satellite dishes, reporters with cameras and microphones. The story had broken nationally overnight. Someone had leaked enough details to make it irresistible. And now the media had descended on the small town like a storm. Earl arrived early to help them deal with it, as did Victoria and Marcus. They set up a perimeter at the gate, refusing entry to anyone without explicit permission. But that didn't stop the cameras from filming from the road. Didn't stop reporters from doing stand-up shots with the mansion in the background. Didn't stop helicopters from flying overhead trying to get aerial footage. Martha and George watched from inside, feeling like prisoners in their own home. This was what Harold had warned them about. This was the price of discovery. They were no longer anonymous elderly people living quietly. They were the couple who found the treasure. They were a story, a headline, a source of fascination and envy and speculation. And then their children arrived. The black sedan came up the driveway around noon, moving slowly through the crowd of journalists who parted reluctantly. David got out first, then Rebecca, Linda, and Thomas. And with them were 2 people Martha didn't recognize. A man in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase, a woman with a tablet, and an expression of cold calculation. Victoria met them at the door before they could knock. "Whatever you're here to say, you can say it outside. My clients aren't receiving visitors." David's face was red. Whether from anger or embarrassment or both, Martha couldn't tell. "We're their children. We have a right to see them. We have a right to discuss this insanity before they make more mistakes they'll regret." Victoria's voice was ice. "Your parents are competent adults who own property and everything discovered within it. You have no legal right to that property or those paintings. Any attempt to claim otherwise will be met with immediate legal action." The man in the expensive suit stepped forward. "My name is Gerald Hastings, and I represent the Hayes children in this matter. We're prepared to file multiple claims. First, that the paintings were hidden by Charles Ashford to avoid seizure during legal proceedings, which means they should escheat to the state rather than belong to the property owners. Second, that even if they belong to the property owners, our clients should have partial ownership as heirs of Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. Third, that our clients have invested time and resources into their parents' care and are entitled to compensation from this windfall." Marcus, who had joined them at the door, smiled without warmth. "Those claims are legally baseless, and you know it. The paintings were sealed in a private residence, not hidden as part of criminal activity. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes own the property absolutely. Their children have no legal claim to assets discovered within, and the courts don't award compensation for unwanted assistance." "We'll sue," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "This isn't fair. We tried to help them. We tried to protect them. And now they're cutting us out completely." Martha finally spoke from behind Victoria. "You tried to warehouse us. You tried to take away our freedom. You fought us in court and told a judge we were incompetent. And now that we've proven you wrong, you want a share of what we found? No. The answer is no. Linda was crying, as she often did. But, Mom, you don't need all this money. You can't possibly spend it. Why can't you share it with your family? We're your children. Doesn't that mean anything? It means you'll get what we choose to give you, George said, stepping into view beside Martha. Not what you demand, not what you try to take, what we freely give, if and when we decide you deserve it. Thomas tried one more time, his voice desperate. The media is camped outside. This is a circus. Let us help you manage this. Let us protect you from people who'll try to take advantage. We can work together as a family. We have lawyers and advisors we trust, Martha said. We don't need your help. We don't want your help. And until you can look at us and see capable adults instead of incompetent children who need managing, we have nothing more to discuss. Gerald Hastings pulled out papers from his briefcase. Then you'll be receiving these formally. Multiple lawsuits claiming various interests in the collection. We'll tie this up in court for years if necessary. You won't be able to sell a single painting until it's resolved. Marcus took the papers without looking at them. File whatever you want. We'll defeat every claim, and we'll countersue for harassment. Your clients just lost a court case 3 weeks ago, trying to prove the same incompetence you're implying now. No judge will look favorably on a second attempt motivated by financial gain. The confrontation ended with David shouting threats as Victoria and Marcus physically blocked the doorway. The children left, pushing through the crowd of journalists who immediately swarmed them with questions and cameras. Martha watched from the window as Rebecca and Linda gave tearful interviews about elderly parents who'd lost touch with family values. As David painted himself as a concerned son fighting to protect vulnerable people from exploitation, as Thomas expressed confusion and hurt about being shut out of his parents' lives, the stories that ran that night were split. Some outlets focused on the treasure discovery, the enormous value, the historical significance. Others focused on the family drama, elderly parents versus worried children, painting Martha and George as either triumphant underdogs or stubborn old people too proud to accept help. The comments online were even worse. Thousands of strangers weighing in with opinions about people they'd never met, about a situation they couldn't possibly understand. That night, Martha and George sat together in their bedroom, the house locked down, security system armed, the world pressing in from all sides. The mansion that had been their refuge, their project, their proof of continued capability, now felt like a cage. The discovery that should have been triumph felt tainted by greed and attention, and the way their children had looked at them like adversaries rather than parents. I thought finding the paintings would solve everything, Martha whispered. Prove we were right. Show everyone we weren't crazy. George pulled her close. It did prove that, but it also changed everything. Money does that, especially this much money. Do you regret it? She asked. Finding them? He thought for a long moment. No, because we found them together. Because we did it ourselves. Because even if everything that comes next is complicated and difficult, we proved something important. We proved we still matter. Outside, camera flashes lit up the darkness as journalists photographed the mansion from every angle. Helicopters had been circling since afternoon, their searchlights sweeping across the property like the place was under siege. And in homes across the country, millions of people watched news reports about the elderly couple and their hidden treasure, forming opinions and taking sides, and making judgments about lives they couldn't begin to understand. But inside the mansion, in a room they'd made warm and safe through their own hard work, Martha and George held each other, and knew one absolute truth. They had bought this place for $1,500 when everyone said they were foolish. They had fought their own children in court when everyone said they should just accept help. They had opened a sealed wall when everyone would have told them to leave it alone. And they had discovered, against all odds, that the mansion they'd risked everything for held treasures worth more than $200 million. That the gamble their children called insane was actually the smartest decision they'd ever made. That the two old people everyone wanted to manage and control and put away were still capable of extraordinary things. The battle wasn't over. The lawsuits would come. The media attention would get worse before it got better. Their children might never forgive them, but they had won something more valuable than even $230 million. They had won the right to live their own lives, make their own choices, and prove that age is just a number that doesn't define worth or capability, or the possibility of miracles. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. But tonight, they had each other. They had their mansion, and they had the satisfaction of knowing they'd been right all along. Sometimes the people the world dismisses are the ones who find the greatest treasures. Sometimes the risks everyone says you shouldn't take are exactly the ones you should. And sometimes, just sometimes, betting everything on yourself pays off in ways no one could have imagined. The lawsuits came like clockwork, delivered by process servers who had to navigate through the media circus still camped outside the mansion gates. 3 separate filings within 2 weeks. David and Rebecca claimed that as primary caregivers, they were entitled to compensation from the discovery. Linda filed for a share based on money she claimed to have lent Martha and George over the years. Loans that had never been documented because they were family. Thomas, perhaps the most desperate, claimed that his parents had promised him inheritance rights in conversations he couldn't prove ever happened. Marcus Feldman reviewed each lawsuit with the same expression of professional disdain. "These are nuisance suits," he told Martha and George during a meeting in the library. The hidden panel now permanently open. A reminder of what they'd discovered. Your children know they have no legal standing. They're hoping you'll settle just to make the problem go away. They're counting on you feeling guilty or tired or overwhelmed. We're all 3 of those things, Martha said quietly. But we're also angry. Good, Marcus replied. Anger is useful. It keeps you from giving in when you shouldn't. The legal battle stretched across 5 months. From December through April, depositions where Martha and George sat across tables from their own children and answered questions designed to make them look confused, incompetent, or manipulative. Court hearings where lawyers argued arcane points of property law and inheritance rights, while journalists filled the gallery taking notes. Each appearance felt like a betrayal. Each legal maneuver another knife in the wounds that had started to form the day their children first suggested Riverside Gardens. But Victoria and Marcus were relentless. They presented documentation showing that Martha and George had purchased the property legally and outright. They produced the original auction records, the deed transfer, the surveys showing the property boundaries and everything within them. They brought in Earl Watson to testify again about their competence and capability. They had Harold Chen explain how the sealed room and its contents were clearly part of the property structure, not separate assets that could be claimed independently. And they had the judge's previous ruling from the conservatorship hearing, the one where Judge Morrison had explicitly found Martha and George mentally competent. That ruling hung over every new claim like an anchor, making it nearly impossible for the children to argue their parents weren't capable of managing their own affairs when a court had already determined otherwise, just months earlier. The turning point came in March during a particularly contentious hearing. David's lawyer was questioning George about his decision-making process, trying to establish a pattern of impulsive behavior. The lawyer, a man named Richardson, with a voice like oil and eyes like a predator, was good at his job. "Mr. Hayes, isn't it true that you purchased this property after seeing a single newspaper advertisement?" Richardson asked, his tone suggesting this was obviously irrational. "Yes," George replied calmly. "You didn't have it inspected by a professional? No. You didn't consult with your children, who had more experience with real estate transactions? No. You didn't even visit the property before the auction? We visited it the morning of the auction," George corrected. Before bidding, Richardson smiled like this proved his point. "So you saw a condemned mansion, visited it for what? An hour, and decided to spend your life savings on it, based on a feeling?" George looked at his son David, sitting at the plaintiff's table, then back at Richardson. "I decided to spend my money on a choice that was mine, on a life that was mine, on proving that I was still capable of making my own decisions, and I was right. That mansion held something worth $230 million. Tell me, Mr. Richardson, what investments have your clients made that showed better judgment than mine?" The courtroom went silent. Richardson tried to recover, but the damage was done. Even the judge, a different one this time, a man named Peterson, who'd seemed sympathetic to the children's arguments, looked at George with something like respect. Victoria used that moment to file a motion to dismiss all claims with prejudice, and to award Martha and George legal fees for defending against frivolous litigation. The motion cited harassment, bad faith, and abuse of process. Marcus added a counterclaim for intentional infliction of emotional distress, detailing how the lawsuits had caused Martha to develop anxiety and George to suffer stress-related health issues. The children's lawyers tried to push back, but their case was crumbling. In April, Judge Peterson ruled from the bench, not even taking time to write a full opinion. "All claims are dismissed with prejudice," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "The plaintiff's arguments are without legal merit. Property belongs to those who purchase it, including anything discovered within that property. The defendants are awarded $150,000 in attorney's fees, to be paid jointly by the plaintiffs." He looked directly at David, Rebecca, Linda, and Thomas. "I understand family dynamics are complicated. I understand that watching your parents make choices you disagree with is difficult. But your parents are competent adults who made a wise investment, even if you couldn't see it at the time. This court will not allow you to profit from their success or punish them for proving you wrong. If you continue to harass them through legal action, I will consider sanctions. Do you understand?" The children nodded, some with anger, some with resignation. As they filed out of the courtroom, not one of them looked at Martha and George. Not one of them said goodbye. That night, Martha cried for the first time since the discovery. Not from sadness exactly, but from the weight of it all finally lifting. The legal battle was over. Their ownership was absolute. Their children had no more weapons to use against them. It should have felt like victory, and it did, but it also felt like loss. The loss of the family they'd once had. The loss of the relationship they'd thought would last forever. The loss of children who looked at them with love instead of resentment. George held her while she cried, his own tears silent on his cheeks. "We won," he said finally, "but the price was high." "Too high?" she asked. He thought for a long moment. "No, because the alternative was losing ourselves, losing our dignity, spending our last years being managed like children. This way, we lost our children's approval, but we kept ourselves. And maybe someday they'll understand that was the right choice. With the legal battles behind them, Martha and George could finally address what to do with the collection. The obvious answer was to sell it, to take the $230 million and live in comfort for their remaining years. Marcus had already fielded offers from auction houses and private collectors. Sotheby's wanted to create a special sale dedicated entirely to the Ashford collection. A hedge fund billionaire offered $200 million for the whole collection. Cash, no auction necessary. But Martha and George surprised everyone, including themselves, by saying no to immediate sale. They wanted time to think, to understand what they had, to make decisions that felt right rather than rushed. The paintings had waited 100 years in that sealed room. They could wait a bit longer. Instead, they focused on the mansion itself. With money no longer a constraint, they could restore it properly. They hired a construction company that specialized in historic restoration. Workers who understood the value of preserving original details while making the structure safe and functional. Over the next 6 months, the mansion transformed. The roof was completely rebuilt, new slate tiles matching the original pattern. Every window was repaired or replaced with period-appropriate glass. The plumbing and electrical systems were updated to modern standards, but hidden within the original structure. The grand staircase was reinforced and refinished. The ballroom's collapsed chandelier was replaced with a historically accurate reproduction. Room by room, the mansion came back to life. Martha and George lived through the construction, refusing to leave even when contractors suggested it would be easier. This was their home, earned through courage and vindicated by discovery. They weren't going anywhere. They got used to the sound of hammers and saws, to workers calling to each other, to the daily transformation of ruin into beauty. Earl was there constantly, overseeing details, teaching younger workers techniques he'd learned over 60 years. He'd become more than a friend. He was family in a way that mattered more than blood. Someone who'd believed in them when their own children hadn't. Someone who'd seen potential where others saw only foolishness. Harold Chen became a fixture as well, curating a small, permanent exhibition in 3 rooms, dedicated to telling the story of Charles Ashford, his collection, and the century it had remained hidden. He assembled photographs, documents, and context, creating something educational and beautiful. When people toured the mansion, they wouldn't just see a restored building. They'd see history brought back to life. By September, almost a year after they'd first opened the hidden wall, the mansion was finished. The restoration had cost nearly $2 million, but it was worth every penny. The Ashford estate stood proud again, no longer a ruin but a monument to persistence and possibility. And Martha and George, now 74 and 77, stood on the front steps looking at what they'd built, what they'd restored, what they'd proven was possible. "We did it," Martha said simply. "We did," George agreed. Now comes the harder part, deciding what it all means. The decision about the paintings came gradually, through conversations with Earl and Harold and Pastor Michaels, through long nights talking in the bedroom they'd made their own, through quiet reflection on what mattered and what legacy meant. They didn't need $230 million. They needed purpose. They needed to feel like their lives had meant something beyond survival, beyond just getting by, beyond the small concerns that had consumed so many years. They decided to sell 25 paintings through Sotheby's, keeping the best and most historically significant ones. The sale would generate approximately $140 million after commissions and taxes. More money than they could possibly spend, but manageable, in a way that $250 million wasn't. Money that could do real good without overwhelming them. The auction happened in November, a year and a month after the discovery. Sotheby's created a catalog that read like an art history textbook. Each painting photographed beautifully, its provenance traced, its significance explained. The event attracted collectors from around the world, museum representatives with acquisition budgets, and journalists covering what was being called the most important American art sale in a generation. Martha and George attended but sat in the back, watching as painting after painting sold for prices that still seemed impossible. The Mary Cassatt went for $26 million to a Japanese collector. The Winslow Homer sold for $19 million to a consortium of American museums. A John Singer Sargent portrait fetched $32 million from a private buyer who remained anonymous. When it was over, when the final gavel had fallen, and the totals were calculated, Martha and George had cleared $142 million. They sat in their hotel room that night, in New York City where the auction had taken place, and tried to understand what that number meant. "It means we were right," George said finally. "About everything. About the mansion. About fighting to keep it. About refusing to let anyone tell us what we could or couldn't do. We weren't crazy. We were smarter than anyone gave us credit for." Martha nodded, then smiled. "Our children are going to hate this part of the story." "Let them," George replied. "They made their choices. Now we get to make ours." The remaining 28 paintings, including some of the most valuable and historically significant pieces, were donated to museums across the country. The Smithsonian American Art Museum received the Whistler Nocturne and 3 other works. The Metropolitan Museum of Art got the largest Sargent and 2 companion pieces. Regional museums in states where Martha and George had lived received pieces appropriate to their collections. Each donation came with the stipulation that the painting be displayed as part of the Ashford collection, keeping the story alive, ensuring that people would know what had been found and how and why it mattered. The tax deductions from these donations were substantial, reducing their tax burden on the sold works significantly. But more importantly, they ensured the paintings would be seen by the public, studied by scholars, preserved for future generations. Charles Ashford had hidden his collection from a world that wanted to seize it. Martha and George were giving it back to a world that could finally appreciate it. With their financial future secure, Martha and George turned their attention to the community that had supported them when their own family hadn't. They established the Ashford Foundation with an initial endowment of $20 million, dedicated to supporting elderly independence, historic preservation, and arts education. The foundation funded programs teaching seniors new skills, from technology to carpentry to painting. It provided grants for elderly people fighting conservatorship battles, offering legal support to those who couldn't afford Victoria Mason's rates. It supported restoration projects for endangered historic buildings, ensuring that more structures like the mansion could be saved and repurposed. And it created scholarships for art students, particularly those from working-class backgrounds, who reminded Martha and George of themselves when they were young. They donated $5 million to the local community center to build an addition specifically for senior activities. Not a nursing home, not a facility, but a place where elderly people could gather, learn, create, and prove they were still vital parts of the community. It was named the Hayes Center for Active Aging, and its motto, suggested by Earl with Martha's enthusiastic approval, was "Never too late." They funded the restoration of 3 other historic homes in the region, turning them into museums and community spaces. They established a scholarship fund at the local high school for students pursuing careers in the trades, honoring Earl's lifetime of craftsmanship. They donated $1 million to Pastor Michael's church, with the instruction that it be used to support elderly congregation members facing financial hardship. And they set up trust funds for each of their 4 children, smaller than they might have been if relationships had remained intact, but still substantial. $5 million each, structured to pay out over 20 years, ensuring a lifetime of security but not creating instant wealth that might be squandered. The letter accompanying each trust was brief. "This is a gift, not a reconciliation. We hope someday you'll understand why we fought so hard to keep our independence. Until then, we want you to know that despite everything, we still love you. We just can't let you control us. Mom and Dad." Mom, Mom, Mom. The responses varied. Thomas called, crying, apologizing, asking if they could try to rebuild their relationship. They said yes, cautiously, agreeing to family dinners once a month, with strict boundaries about what could be discussed. Linda wrote a long letter, pages and pages of justification mixed with regret, never quite apologizing but acknowledging she'd been wrong. They wrote back, shorter but kind, leaving the door open. Rebecca sent a brief thank you card, formal and cold, but at least acknowledging the gift. David sent nothing at all for 6 months. When he finally reached out, it was with a business proposal, suggesting ways he could help manage their foundation. They declined politely and didn't hear from him again for a year. The relationships would never be what they once were. That ship had sailed, sunk by lawsuits and betrayals, and the fundamental inability of the children to see their parents as autonomous adults. But they existed, in some form, which was more than Martha and George had expected in the dark days of legal battles. What surprised them most was how their story resonated beyond their small town, beyond their own family drama. Letters arrived daily from elderly people across the country. Some had seen the news coverage. Others had read articles in magazines or online. All of them had been inspired by the story of 2 old people who refused to be managed, who took a risk everyone said was foolish, and who found both treasure and vindication. One letter came from a 78-year-old woman in Oregon, whose children were trying to force her into a nursing home. She wrote that Martha and George's story had given her the courage to hire a lawyer and fight. She won, kept her house, and was now living independently with support from friends and neighbors she'd organized herself. "You showed me that old doesn't mean helpless," she wrote. "Thank you for that." Another letter came from a man in Florida, 82 years old, who had been declared incompetent by his children and placed in a facility against his will. He saw the news coverage from the common room television. He contacted a legal aid organization that connected him with a lawyer, inspired by Martha and George's case. After a 6-month battle, his conservatorship was overturned. He was living in his own apartment again. "I got my life back because you fought for yours," he wrote. The letters kept coming. Hundreds of them, then thousands. Elderly people who felt invisible finding hope. Adult children who realized they'd been treating their parents like children and apologizing. Lawyers who specialized in elder rights, reporting an increase in people willing to fight unjust conservatorships. Social workers, noting a cultural shift in how society viewed aging and autonomy. Martha and George read every letter. They couldn't respond to all of them, but they tried. They hired an assistant, a woman named Jennifer who'd just retired from a career in social work, to help manage the correspondence and the foundation. She worked from a beautiful office they created in what had once been the mansion's smoking room, and she became another member of their chosen family. On their 53rd wedding anniversary, Martha and George hosted an open house at the mansion. They invited everyone who had supported them: Earl and Harold and Pastor Michaels, Victoria and Marcus, the contractors who'd restored the building, the neighbors who'd brought food and encouragement, the townspeople who'd believed in them, the journalists who'd told their story fairly, and 3 of their 4 children, Thomas and Linda and Rebecca, who came cautiously, still wounded but trying. David didn't come, and his absence hurt despite everything. But they couldn't force reconciliation, couldn't make their children see them differently if they chose not to. They could only control their own actions, their own choices, their own legacy. The party filled the mansion with life and laughter and music from a local band that played big band standards Martha and George had danced to when they were young. Tours were given of the restoration and Harold's exhibition. The remaining paintings were on display in a climate-controlled gallery, available for viewing but protected behind special glass. People marveled at the art, at the story, at what these 2 elderly people had accomplished. Earl gave a toast in the grand ballroom, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. "I met George and Martha about 1.5 years ago," he said. "They were 2 people trying to fix up a place everyone said was beyond fixing, including themselves, probably. But they didn't quit. They worked harder than people half their age. They learned new skills, they took risks, and they showed all of us that the story doesn't end just because you get old. Sometimes the best chapters come late, when you've finally figured out who you are and what you want, and you're brave enough to reach for it." The crowd applauded. Martha felt tears on her cheeks but didn't wipe them away. These were good tears, earned tears, the kind that come from a life fully lived. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Martha and George stood on the grand front steps, watching car lights disappear down the driveway. The mansion glowed behind them, every window lit. No longer a dark hulk on a hillside, but a beacon visible for miles. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd just gone to Riverside Gardens?" Martha asked. "If we'd done what they wanted?" George put his arm around her. "Every day, and every day I'm grateful we didn't. We'd be comfortable, maybe, safe, but we wouldn't be us. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have proven anything except that old people should do what they're told." Martha leaned into him, feeling his warmth, his steadiness, his presence that had anchored her for 53 years. "We're not done yet, are we?" he smiled. "Not even close. We've got the foundation to run, more buildings to restore, more people to help, more life to live on our own terms." 2 years after the discovery, Martha was invited to speak at a national conference on aging and autonomy. She was terrified, had never spoken to more than a handful of people at once, had no idea what to say to an audience of hundreds. But George encouraged her, and Jennifer helped her prepare, and she found herself on a stage in Chicago looking out at faces that ranged from young social workers to elderly advocates to policymakers who could change laws. She spoke from her heart, not from prepared remarks, just telling her story about feeling dismissed, about the intervention, about buying the mansion everyone said was foolish, about the court battle and the discovery, and everything that came after. But mostly she spoke about worth. "Society tells us that when we get old, we become less," she said, her voice stronger than she expected, "less capable, less valuable, less deserving of autonomy. We're told to be grateful for being managed, for being cared for being protected from ourselves. And some people need that care, truly need it, and there's no shame in that. She paused. But many of us don't. Many of us are still capable, still sharp, still full of dreams and desires and plans. And when our children or our society or our own internalized fears tell us to sit down and be quiet and accept diminishment, we need to remember something important. She looked out at the audience. We get to say no. We get to choose. We get to risk and fail, and succeed, and prove that age is just a number that doesn't define our worth. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Martha stood on that stage, overwhelmed, and understood that their story had become bigger than just 2 people and a mansion. It had become a symbol, a rallying cry, proof that change was possible at any age. In the 3rd year after the discovery, the Ashford Foundation funded its 50th historic building restoration, its 100th scholarship, and its 500th legal defense for an elderly person fighting for independence. The mansion had become a destination, with tours available 3 days a week, bringing visitors from around the world to see both the beautiful restoration and Harold's exhibition about the lost collection. Martha and George, now 76 and 79, still lived in the mansion, still worked on projects, still learned new things. George had taken up woodworking seriously, creating furniture pieces that combined his machinist's precision with Earl's carpentry teaching. Martha had started painting, discovering she had a talent for watercolors, her work displayed in a small gallery in town, where tourists bought them without knowing they were painted by the woman who'd found the Ashford collection. Their health remained good, sustained perhaps by purpose and work that mattered, and the validation of knowing they'd been right all along. They hired help when they needed it, weren't too proud to accept assistance with heavy lifting or complex repairs. But they remained independent, making their own choices, living their own lives, proving every day that 76 and 79 were just numbers. Earl, now 84, still came 3 days a week, though mostly now to have coffee and work on small projects, and tell stories about the early days when the mansion was a ruin, and Martha and George were just 2 foolish old people trying to fix it. He'd become something like a father figure, filling a space their own fathers had left decades ago, showing them what healthy aging looked like when it wasn't managed but supported. On what would be their 55th wedding anniversary, Martha and George did something they'd planned for months. They gathered their 4 children, insisting all of them come, even David, who resisted until George made it clear this was important. They met in the library, where everything had started, where the hidden panel stood open as a permanent reminder. George spoke first. "We asked you here because we're not getting any younger. We're 76 and 79. We could have 10 more years or 10 more days, and before time runs out, we need to say some things." The children sat silently, wary, probably expecting ultimatums or demands, or another lecture about their failures. Martha continued, "We forgive you for the intervention, for the court battles, for trying to control us. We understand that you were scared, that you thought you were helping, that our culture teaches children to see elderly parents as problems to manage rather than people to respect. We forgive you, even if we can't forget, even if our relationship will never be what it was." Rebecca started crying. Linda reached for tissues. Thomas looked at his hands. David's face was unreadable. "But more importantly," George said, "we need you to forgive us for not communicating better, for not understanding your fears, for fighting so hard that we damaged our family, maybe beyond repair. We chose independence over peace. And that choice had costs. We're sorry for those costs, even if we couldn't have made a different choice. David finally spoke, his voice rough. I don't know if I can forgive you. You made me look like a fool. You made all of us look like greedy children who just wanted your money. You destroyed our reputation in this town. George nodded. I know, and I'm sorry for that. But David, you tried to take away our freedom. You tried to declare us incompetent. You fought us in court twice. So maybe we both need to forgive each other and understand that we both caused harm, even if we thought we were doing the right thing. The conversation that followed was the most honest their family had ever had. Painful, sometimes angry, often tearful, but real. They didn't solve everything. Wounds that deep don't heal in one conversation. But they made progress, established boundaries, found a way to exist together, even if the relationships would never be what they once were. Before the children left, Martha had Jennifer bring in 4 envelopes. Inside each was a document naming that child as a board member of the Ashford Foundation, if they wanted the position. It came with a small salary, real responsibilities, and the chance to be part of the legacy Martha and George were building. You don't have to accept, Martha said. But we wanted to offer you a way back in, a way to be part of what we're doing, if you can accept that we're in charge and this is our vision, not yours. Thomas accepted immediately. Linda said she needed time to think, but seemed touched. Rebecca took her envelope but didn't commit. David left his on the table and walked out. But 3 out of 4 was more than Martha and George had hoped for. And it was a start. As their 70s gave way toward their 80s, Martha and George became something unexpected. Icons of elderly empowerment. They gave interviews, always together, always honest about the struggles and triumphs. They appeared in documentaries about aging and autonomy. They were profiled in magazines, ranging from AARP to The New Yorker. Their story was optioned by a production company wanting to make a limited series, though they insisted on approval over the script, unwilling to let their lives be sensationalized. But more than the fame or attention, what mattered was the impact. The cultural conversation about aging began to shift, slowly but noticeably. More families had difficult conversations about independence versus safety. More elderly people fought back against unwanted conservatorships. More communities created programs supporting active aging rather than just managing decline. Laws were proposed in several states, making it harder to declare competent adults incompetent simply because they were old. Martha and George couldn't take credit for all of it, but they'd been the spark, the story that crystallized something people were already feeling, and that mattered more than money, more than the mansion, more than the treasure they'd found. On a cold evening in November, 4 years after opening the hidden wall, Martha and George sat together in the library where it had all begun. They'd just finished a tour for a group of schoolchildren who'd listened with wide eyes to the story of the sealed room and the paintings worth millions. Now the house was quiet. Just the 2 of them, and the soft ticking of the restored grandfather clock in the hall. "Do you think we would have been happy at Riverside Gardens?" Martha asked. A question she'd never voiced before. George considered it seriously. Maybe, if we'd never known there was an alternative. If we'd accepted that being old meant accepting what others chose for us, we might have been comfortable, safe, even content, in a limited way. But not happy, Martha finished. Not really. Not the way we are now. No, George agreed. Because happiness isn't about safety or comfort. It's about being true to yourself, about making choices that matter even when they're hard, about proving to yourself that you still have agency and value and purpose. They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd spent 55 years together and discovered that the best part wasn't the beginning like everyone says. The best part was now, at the end, when they'd finally figured out who they were and had the courage to be those people, no matter what anyone else thought. Martha and George Hayes lived on in their mansion for many more years, long enough to see their foundation help thousands of elderly people fight for independence, long enough to see cultural attitudes shift, long enough to know that their story mattered when they passed. Within months of each other, the way couples married for 6 decades often do, they left behind a legacy that was about more than art or money, or even a beautifully restored mansion. They left behind proof that worth doesn't diminish with age. That courage can emerge at 73 and 76. That the people society dismisses as past their prime are sometimes the ones who discover the greatest treasures, and that sometimes, just sometimes, betting everything on yourself pays off in ways no one could have imagined. Because they'd bought a crumbling mansion for $1,500 when everyone said they were foolish. They'd fought their own children in court when everyone said they should just accept help. They'd opened a sealed wall when everyone would have told them to leave well enough alone. And they'd discovered not just $230 million worth of art, but something far more valuable. They'd discovered themselves, their strength, their worth, and the absolute truth that some of the best chapters of life come late in the story when you finally know who you are, and you're brave enough to live accordingly. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of courage, hope, and never giving up. Click to continue this journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe you're never too old to be extraordinary.